This is Nick Ricada, and you're listening to a Sunset Sea production. It's better than whiskey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of the Imperial Tides podcast. I'm your host, Holden, and today as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Simone, and today we're going to be covering part 4 of Berlin Alexanderplatz. And this episode is called, it's an interesting one. It's called A Handful of People in the Depths of Silence. Ooh, big and nice and gloomy like that. And so, as always, we start these off with a little summary, and so, what happens in this episode? Well, it's 1928 in Berlin, and Franz has run away from all his problems to basically drink himself penniless in a shabby apartment complex somewhere. And most of the episode is about him dealing with his existential crisis that that he's going through at the moment, and his alcoholism it's cropped up. It's how he's dealing with the issues that occurred in the previous episodes. Everything from being released from prison to for the first time in 4 years to struggling to find work, working and failing as a tie holder salesman and as a newspaper vendor, and then being ostracized for selling Nazi newspapers, and then everything up to now. Most of the episode is about him trying to overcome that, and his neighbor in the apartment complex is this man named Bauman. And Bauman guides him through his suffering and compares his struggle to that of Job's in the Bible, the book of Job and all that. Job lost everything, and in his life, he was once a very respectable member of his community, but then it was all taken away from him, and he was forced to continue, going on living after being dumped in a cabbage farm, a cabbage patch. One of the most humiliating things that could happen to a person, but especially a person of his status as well. And so, humiliated, lost, and empty. Franz and Job are connected by their struggle in that sense. And but at the end of the episode, by the end, Franz manages to pull himself out of his situation and leave the complex right as the landlords themselves are arrested for burglary. They robbed a department store across the street, and so after that, Franz returns to his old stomping grounds and reunites with Mech, who reveals that Lena ran away one day, and now it's just the two of them again. And also during the episode, as well, Franz also reunites with the old newspaper vendor from episode 2, who was selling the controversial magazines about homosexuality and feminism and sexual liberation and all these sort of taboo subjects of the time. They have a conversation, and the vendor reveals that he actually lost a testicle to tuberculosis and that he's getting closer to dying. And then also another noteworthy interaction would, of course, be the daily. Every part has thus far, all 4 parts have had a feature meeting from encounter with Eva, the prostitute from Franz's past, right? And so in this episode, Franz was also visited by Eva in the apartment complex, and she's in this one. She really is like a sort of angel in the darkness. She shows up during his worst moment. Right, and she confesses her love for him, and offers to actually pay to sustain him, which is implied to be how their relationship worked back when Franz was married before he murdered his wife. It's suggested, or at least through the conversation, it's assumed that the thing they had together. Franz would kind of mooch off of her. She would use the money that she'd get from her clients to sustain their relationship, their life together. And so that was how things used to be. But Franz, he's still committed to trying not to revert back to his old ways, right? And so he tells her that he'll handle his little crisis of faith or existential crisis, whatever we want to call it, on his own, by himself. And she leaves him to get out of it by himself, which he does eventually, right? And finally, last little noteworthy thing before we move on to the discussion, the episode ends with a shot of a newspaper headline that reports that someone named Karl von Ossetsky, so in real life he was a prominent German journalist and pacifist. The headline reads that he's just been condemned for something. The year is the year in this episode is 1928. In real life, Osetsky he died in 1938, 10 years later, at the age of 48, from tuberculosis and other injuries sustained during his time as a prisoner in various concentration camps. Because he was a journalist and a pacifist, award-winning journalist too, very prominent in his circle and all that. He spoke out during the rise of Nazism and during Nazi reign or rule or power, whatever you want to call it. Osetsky was very outspoken against the Nazi Party and against fascism. He was an anti-fascist writer, and that ended up getting him placed in various concentration camps, and then he died at 48. 10 years after this episode is set, like I said. So by including this shot at the very end of this person who will die 10 years later for reporting, for basically predicting what was about to happen, with the 30s and the 40s and all the chaos that ensues in Germany not long after the end of this series. It provides the reader, provides the viewers with some pretty gloomy foreshadowing for what's to come to Germany and the world at large historically, right? It's bad now in the late 1920s, as we've seen with the downturn in the economy, the increasing rates of unemployment, but it's about to get so much worse, and that's basically what that little bit of imagery at the very end is there to say. And so other than that, I feel like we've kind of, I feel like that's a good summary. Did I miss anything, Simone? Is there anything you'd like to add to that before we move on to the talky talk phase of the episode?
It's already well summarized.
Sure, okay. So as always, to start, Simone, what would you rate this episode out of 10 and why?
I'll give it another episode a 9. I didn't expect it. During the first episode, this must be maybe 9.5 or 9. I'm submitting that rating because this is the exact episode that I'm thinking, or my initial impression of how the show would go, or some of the themes that they might touch on.
Yeah, and for me, it's the same. I would also give it a 9. I want to reserve a perfect 10 score for like a future episode, because you never know when something will top this one, because that's how a lot of these things go, right? It's like you think you've gotten to the best it could possibly be, but then the next thing that comes after that immediately shatters that supposed glass ceiling or whatever and makes something happen, And so I'm being by leaving the rating as I do. It's basically just a personal sign for me to be optimistic for the future. I predict that the series will get better and better. It's only going to go up from here, maybe, and there's the potential at least for something that can top this. And not only that, but this is almost a weird. It's a bit of a weird. It's a tricky episode, right? Because this is a whole. This is not a show. It's a complete story from start to finish. It's all planned out, all plotted out a very specific way. It's all continuous. It's not like it's not written like a TV show. It's broken up into parts to kind of make it more palatable for the viewer, right? And so in that sense, it's like a play. You have the first act, then you take an intermission, then you have the second act, then you take another intermission, and then you have the third act, and then you go in, and it's just a way to segment and divide and parse out and ration so that people don't get, so they can give each part as much attention as it deserves, right? And so this is a similar thing. They're just doing that for film, and it's not a common practice, and so that's why it's a little tricky to kind of wrap your head around, because it's not as if every single movie does this. It's not like every single movie is like 15 hours long, but this and this one's a weird one. Again, it's also a TV made for TV miniseries as well. But in any case, to avoid getting too hung up on that aspect of it, what I will say is that this by far, this fourth episode is the best one out of the 4 we've seen so far, right? It's a lot better. It's better than the other 3, but to be fair, to look at it reasonably, the reason why it is so good is because it only works because it goes against the grain of the first 3 episodes. The first 3 episodes were important because they established the precedent, right? They laid down the foundation. That was the groundwork. You couldn't have episode 4 without episodes 1, 2, and 3, because episode 4 is sort of the antithesis of those first 3, right? This is it's a revisiting almost. It's like, the whole series starts out with the movie or whatever. The piece starts out with Franz in the middle of a turmoil, in the middle of some sort of personal crisis of faith, some sort of existential fit, right? And this is that again. This is retreading that same ground, but it means more now because we've had time to familiarize ourselves with the characters, with the environment, with what's going on. It means a lot more, and it's much more impactful because of everything that came before it. So this episode cannot exist without the first three, but it is the best. It's still the best, I think. But that's how I see it. That it has an interesting relationship within the grander, broader context of the series overall so far, right? And it's an interesting one because, from a narrative standpoint, from a drama standpoint or whatever, it's not a whole lot really happens in this part, right? And yet it's significant in that it sheds light on who Franz really is when he's by himself, And so in this episode, we see the version of Franz that he is when he's been thrown into a more into the midst of his own suffering, right? Kind of like how he was in the first one, but there are differences, and we can talk about that later. That's definitely something I'd like to touch upon. But what I will say now, just to establish, whatever, is that, I guess the main difference between the crisis that he has in this fourth episode compared to the one that he has in the first one would probably be that the one that he has in this one is much more personally, directly connected to who he is. It comes more directly from himself. Whereas in the first one, it's more clinical, I guess. It has to do with the psychological side effects of being in prison, right? It's not necessarily, even though he's in prison because of what he did and everything, beating his wife to death with a comb brush and all that. It's like it's a lot less personal, whereas this one is all personal. This one comes completely from him. It's much more direct. So it's different, it's just different. And we can get into that in a bit. But yeah, in this episode, I think what makes this episode so important is that it allows the viewer to see a more honest, almost sort of like purer version of Franz in this one. And for what I would argue is the first time in the series so far, Franz has become in this episode a relatable and sympathetic character, almost even likable, because in this one he's being depicted here as a fundamental human being dealing with, let's just say, fundamental human issues, right? And I think what makes this episode so powerful or whatever is that we have all had slumps and down periods like the one that Franz is having here, right? It's something that anyone can relate to. It's part of the human condition, as they call it, and it's a special thing, I think. It's a life thing, really. It's an existential thing. And the great thing about existentialism in general is that everyone can relate to it because everybody exists, And if you don't exist, then, well, I don't know. But yeah. So all in all, I would say this is the most existential / philosophical episode that we've had so far. And like you said earlier, Simone, it's exactly what I was hoping to see and get out of this series. And in fact, in some ways, it's even better, because the things that they do here are things that I couldn't even have, I wouldn't even have thought of coming in. So it's good. This is solid. I hope that they continue going with this trajectory and all that. I'm looking forward to seeing more now, and I'm glad that I'm glad that it didn't take longer for something like this to happen. It's already episode 4, and the series has changed like so much. There have been so many twists and turns and shifts and everything, and mood changes and all that. And it's like we've gotten to a flavor that I like a lot in particular. So it's nice that there's some variety and there's just a lot of variety and scope. It covers, so far the series has kind of touched all the bases, and will continue to do so, hopefully, right? But I have a good feeling about how things are going to go from here. So yeah, I don't know. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Simone?
The way that we enjoyed the last episode is because we didn't like the previous one. For example, the episode 2, or the episode 2 take a different, ultimately, or episode 3, I guess. There's the episode where he joined the Nazism. Just kind of a bit passive up right now. When he joins the Nazism, it's not really a good episode or where it all started. It's just it's not the direction that we wanted, and now that the fact that the direction of the show changes, the way that we expected, not exactly the expected it to be, but it goes more than what I expected. I guess it's much more the depths that I like or I want to add in these kinds of medias. There's evidences that it might take this path in the first episode, but getting through the second and third, there are some parts of it that are included, but some are not. Especially in episode 2, that some themes that you didn't expect it to be, but some they focus on some things that it looks like it's more likely a trial and error at times. How they make up with the things that are not so good with the previous ones. Especially this one. I remember they're talking about the music that you didn't like in the previous episodes that we covered, and looking back to um feeling the music or while watching the show, looking at the visuals and the listening to carefully to the music if it's really it will connect and it goes along well. It's especially the title. It's everything is concrete and compact in this one. But my rating would not be. I agree with you to give a or to save some rating for the upcoming episodes because we're only in the fourth one and there are 10 more to come. So probably there might be more improvements in the show. And and also what I noticed in this one is it's like you mentioned that it's become more existential. In the last 3 episodes, he seems like that everyone is doing a favor for him, or is it that he just the main character, even though there are tons of chaos or problems. It seems like that not exactly solved, but uh, there's an element that make things works for him easily, even though it's not taking too much effort. We take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, it's much more. It's only him, even though there's a man, Bowman. Uh, it's still him who changed from the start to the end of this episode. It's just he's the one to process. It's all about how he is as a human being.
Yeah. And maybe that's why, maybe that's why he had this second crisis of faith in the first place. Maybe that's what brought him to this point in the first place is that, for the past 3 episodes, he was sort of coasting. You know what I mean? Like he had other people doing the work for him. He was kind of avoiding life because it was all being done for him almost. It's like everything just sort of happens. Everything just sort of fell into place. But now he has to confront it himself. He has to do the work on his own. And, maybe he'll be better off. He'll be stronger off now, because he's done it a little bit now. But, yeah, we'll get into that. It's that's sort of the crux of this episode. That's like the most important thing. It's kind of the core of what goes on here is this the second fit of existential crisis that he has, and the consequences of it, what comes out of it, the good and the bad, everything in between. But yeah, so I mean, I guess just to kick off our discussion, since this is a bit of an unconventional episode, Simone, what I want to know is what do you think of the point of this part is? What did you get out of it as an episode?
There are a lot of things that I get from it, especially from the beginning of the introduction of how things gone or where he is now, especially when he's drunk and getting into the stores of the apartment owner. It's just she's telling some gossips and all the other stuffs that are taking place with other people. And also, he always there are a lot of times that he mentioned that there's a problem with how he view human being. He has the societal issues that we probably are complaining about, but probably we are also the main reason for it, or we also created this kinds of um, complex, not exact complexities, but uh, difficulties in our lives or interbringing issues, or I can find the words, is it? But the the conflict, the intervening conflict of each of our life in this society, it is just how it appeals to me, and it seems like the our own crises as an individual and also in connection to our environment. It seems like that in the last getting back into some stuff that I'm doing is just the last part that I read on my struggle book to offer a man love. Carlo is talking about environment, how environment is shaping us the way it is. That aside from uh, the existential, external, the external things that affects us or the constitutes on how we behave, it's also us who makes these things work or how it will affect us. Even though we are internally as human beings, we are the one who shape or we perceive things. We perceive things differently, but uh, even though it's in all of us, there are a lot of intervening points and perspective that we can look at. We are all differently. We take different approach for each other. The same with the people is present in this episode. They have different faces. We are different from each other. The way that we act from uh, one person to another, and it's really I can say that this episode is very poignant at times, or there are a lot of not only the overarching things that are taking place. It seems that I think it's in the middle or in the beginning, the first half of the show, where he's just drinking beer and looking at his neighbors, a man with his secretary typing stuff about um, uh, law issue or whatnot. And also there's a prostitute where he just winked at, and then uh, she came up the stairs and all the things took place that he didn't like. It's just aside from us, our own battles or what's going on in our minds, and also and externally, each of us are our own. Uh, it overacts like that's how it portrayed in this episode.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And yeah, Knausgaard's a great writer. By the way, because like I said before, right? The viewer needed some time to see how Franz operates on his own, right? And so even though he's not completely alone here, because he has his neighbors, he has Bauman and all that, he's alone in spirit, right? That's where it counts, right? His struggles are his own struggles and nobody else's. His conflicts are his own conflicts and nobody else's, and so on and so forth, right? He is the only one who knows, understands, and can overcome the misery and suffering that have been weighing him down long before the start of the very first episode of the series, right? And I think this episode really helps to highlight that there's something fundamentally twisted and corroded and almost demented about Franz. Something that drove him to beat his wife to death with a comb brush. Something that drove him to a life of crime. Something that brought him into the arms of Ava. Who's his literal heart. She's literally. I mean, she's his literal hooker with a heart of gold, right? That cliched character, right? Like that's who she is to him. And so, yeah, I mean, so Franz is he's demented in a way that's hard to understand, because it's hard to understand most of the time, and so I think it's important that the audience get an entire episode, or part of the overall, series or film that is dedicated to analyzing it, this weird psychological dynamic that's plaguing him. But the episode also does a good job at the same time of not giving away too much, because there's still plenty we don't understand about Franz and his mental states, right? I mean, he's still just as elusive as ever before. But for the first time in the series so far, we've been able to see him in an environment with minimal distractions from the thing that counts the most, which is this weird demon that's stuck in his head. And it's all in all, it creates for it makes for a very intimate episode, very one-on-one. So yeah. And so, I mean, to go off of that, like I said, he's not alone, right? So, and there isn't, even though there isn't much that happens in this episode particularly, things still do happen, right? And there still are other people. And I think the most important person in this episode, aside from Franz, would be his next door neighbor in the apartment complex. And he's a man named Bauman, right? And so, Simone, what I want to ask you is, I don't know, what did you think of Franz's new neighbor, Bauman? Or Bowman?
He's a character that I didn't expect that will show up, because everyone that he met are usually do something not so good to him, or not exactly not so good to do something to it. It's just they are really just background characters at all. They didn't do much help in terms of his internal battle, or they're not able to see who Franz really is, especially with Meg. I guess that even though they are good friends, it seems like there are some boundaries that he can cross on in terms of their friendship, or as Franz as an individual, or he just lets him to think for himself and not in this approach. But it is different. And also looking back to the first episode, the characters that are introduced in this one, the man I forgot the names of his father that he's talking about in the first episode, a man that he just met on the road, and then he told him a lot of stories. It seems like that it turns out that it was kind of made up, or maybe bend in a way that will satisfy his or fulfill the gaps that are in those particular relationship that he has with his father. And there's still a distance that I can see, or they can touch upon a particular side of Franz as him as an individual, with the approach that Bauman gave with or the approach that how he approached Franz is just he seems like that he generally or let himself submerge into his bubble, or get into Franz's bubble of who he really is, or everything that he's in thought, that he's able to what's going on, the internal agony that he's in, he's able to fix it, to bring light inside his one man's mind, but not exactly in the term that he'll just do everything from Franz, just like how Lena and any other character in the last episode do it for him. He lets him to think for himself too. He just points up some big revelations or big truths, and then he'll just let him ponder over these thoughts and think for himself. It's just
Right. Yeah. It's that whole thing of the difference between giving a man a fish to eat and teaching a man how to fish. Because you feed, it's like if you give a man a fish one day, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you feed him for life. That whole thing, right? And it's interesting that you brought up Stefan, the whole Zanowich thing from episode 1, the ginger Jewish, the red-haired Jewish guy who took in Franz immediately after he came out of prison when he was having like that panic attack, right? And he kind of mentored him and nursed him back to health almost a little bit, but it wasn't quite as effective as Bowman's solution seems to be. Bowman's guidance is a bit better. And they're almost like, him and Zanowich, Bowman and Zanowich are almost kind of parallel. They're almost polar opposites when it comes down to it, in terms of their approaches and in terms of their styles and their methods and just what they represent in general, right? Because the problem with Zanowicz was that he was delusional. He didn't want to confront the truth about his father. He didn't want to face life head on. He wasn't into reality. He would much rather live in his own little fantasy, his own little delusion, right? That his dad was some sort of, ideal, like some sort of hero or, some huge success, when he was really just, he killed himself in prison and then had a bunch of garbage dumped over his dead body. That's how that's how his life ended, right? But Bauman is the opposite of all of Zanowicz, because Bauman he's an interesting guy. He's practical, he's stone cold, sober. He takes life head on, and he comes from a harsh past because he was a soldier in World War I, is what they say, right? He was, he worked in some sort of medical capacity or something during the war, right? And so he's seen some of the worst that the world and life has to offer, and yet he's still able to carry on living, and he lives honestly and without delusions of any sort, and really, like, based on how he's presented in the episode, it's like really the worst thing you can say about him is that he can tend to be a bit ghoulish about the whole thing. But other than that, he seems to be a free man, and for better or worse, he appears to have accepted not only the circumstances of his own life, but of life in general, for the world at large and all the other people in it. And it's made him firm and solid in his character, his personal character, in terms of his integrity and his ability to live and to live well, And in the way I see it, it's like Franz could be like him. Franz could be another Bauman if he applied himself properly. He has the potential to do so, and and so could all of us in a certain sense, right? And so in a way, Bauman, I kind of feel like Bauman represents a sort of ideal that we should all strive towards. I don't know. What do you think of all of that, Simone?
Yeah, I think I agree with it. Franz has the ability. These episodes let us see or what Franz is capable of. The possibility or a different routes for him that he might routes it or paths that he could take in the future or to make things better. He might be in agony because there are a lot of arcing or things that are playing inside his mind. The pursuit to be a good human being, to be someone who will be able to live on in this kind of messed up society that he's in, and also the intervening things that he is trying to survive or to come up with to be on his own. He has this ability or possibility to be he's capable of being or to live like Bauman, especially now that he finally met this man and know who he is or how this particular approach will work or what's some of the things that he do wrong. He can be able to. He has this, and I'm looking forward to some hopes. I'm there's a hope in France that he's not just the way that he is portrayed in the first three episodes, that he's not just uh he's portrayed as a hero, but he's not. But maybe in the future we might see him as a true hero at some sense.
Yeah, maybe a true hero, or maybe just sane or redeemed. Maybe just not a bad guy. Maybe it's not about being good so much as it is being not bad. Not evil. And maybe that's maybe realistically, maybe that's all we can hope for or whatever. But that's a pessimistic perspective, I guess, for another day or whatever. But yeah. So then, of course, there's Bauman. Other characters, though, there's also of course the so I don't know, Simone. What did you think of the woman who tries to sleep with Franz because he winked at her from outside his window when he was looking at all during the scene when like you said, he was looking at all the other people in the apartment complex and in the buildings across the street, just in the general area. He catches his eyes. He locks eyes with this blonde woman who kind of smiles at him and he winks back at her. And not like 2 seconds after that, honestly, she shows up to his door out of nowhere and offers him sex. And when he rejects her, she calls him limp dicked. And runs off in a huff. And so I guess what I'm wondering is what was the purpose of this scene in the overall episode?
Maybe it's about building tolerance, and when it comes to not a, maybe in this scene it was portrayed as a temptation or something that opened itself exactly, but uh, as her that we would see that she's a prostitute or someone who sells her body. Uh, there are also some points that we can get from her character. She might be also a victim of this messed up society, or this is the way that she was brought up, or just her way of surviving.
Yeah, yeah, and then maybe she does represent like a temptation, the opportunity for Franz to sort of jump back into the same tendencies and habits that he had been for the past 3 episodes, and also just before them, obviously, with this whole life of kind of decadent, whatever hedonistic, pleasure-seeking, vice, indulging behavior. But I think and I think overall, like all in all, I think what's important about the scene is probably just how it reinforces the idea that Franz is a chick magnet. He attracts a lot of women, and something that something that I'd noticed about him before but hadn't talked about was how he is at least a partial personification of certain Greco-Roman ideals, and that he has the sort of physique that was praised in the times of classical antiquity, right? Like look at any classical sculpture of a man, for example, and he's likely to be in a peak physical form, and even though Franz is a bit fat, like he's not like sculpted, like he doesn't have like chiseled abs or whatever. He's got the bulk, you know what I mean? He's physically imposing, and he isn't someone you'd want to fuck with, let's just say, right? And at the start of the 20th century, I'm sure many women were looking for someone like that for protection and security, and so just based on the physical aspect of his character alone, it would make sense that so many women would want him, right? And again, he's not the most good-looking guy in the world, but there's a certain sense of danger to him, a certain menace that I think the women who gravitate towards him are attracted to. It's like moths to a flame. Moths they fly to the fire or the light, even though it'll if it's a flame, if it's an open flame, it will burn them to death. And yet the moths still come to it. Yet they're still inclined to go to the light, go towards the light, and all that. And there's this weird sort of primitive psychology behind the link between dangerous men on the one hand and danger-seeking women on the other. And it's again, I think I brought this up before, but Ted Bundy, the American serial killer of the mid to late 20th century, he had plenty of women mailing him marriage proposals in jail. In prison, knowing full well what he did, all the people he killed, all the manipulation he did and everything. And it's like, it's a bizarre thing. And, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if there is anybody out there who knows why it exists. I mean, there might be there might be some psychological like studies on it, but, just speaking as a lay person, it's like, it's kind of hard or a layman, it's like, I don't know, but it does exist. It's a thing. It's just it's something, and I wonder if the show will have an answer or an explanation for it by the very end. But you never know. But I don't know. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Simone?
Yeah, that particular element of him or his character, uh, that's what I noticed in the first or second episode, that is also the reason why some of the characters seems like to pave a way for him to be able to do things easily, to get things easily, even though um in this particular era that people might not treat him in a way to be that good or sympathetic towards him.
Yeah. And that's the thing about the characterization in the series so far, right? It's largely metaphorical, a lot like there is Franz. Franz is the central figure, right? I would say he's like fully developed as a character, like he's the most fleshed out in terms of the writing and whatnot. But and then there's also like a handful of supporting characters like Mech and Otto and all. They stand on their own, but pretty much every other character, all the background characters, all the secondary characters or tertiary characters or whatever you want to call them, they're characterized, they're depicted in a very sort of metaphorical way, right? Like they're all defined in relation to how they treat Franz almost, and it's like Kafka, it's surreal, they don't really act realistically. Like the way they treat him, it's plausible, it's realistic enough, but I wouldn't say it's likely. And so it's all done in a way to kind of to make a certain point, right? And so that's something I've noticed is that they're using that to convey the themes and the message that I guess Doblin and also Fassbinder. Doblin was the writer of the original novel. Fassbinder is the director of this adaptation. They are the vehicles through which those two are conveying what they want to convey, right? The message or whatever, the moral, whatever you want to call it, right? And so, yeah, there's this aspect of metaphorical characterization that has been present in the work throughout, but it was particularly accentuated in this one, emphasized in this one, because this episode is a contrast. It is an opposite of the three that came before, right? And so now you've seen one way now, and now we've seen another. Now you put those together, now it makes things look much more clearly, you can see things much more clearly now, right? Because you've got both sides of the coin or whatever. And so hopefully moving forward, there's, there might be this, I guess, clear-eyedness, both in the viewers and in Franz, maybe, hopefully. That's the hope anyway. But for the viewers anyway, I think this episode provided a lot of clarity. That's the word for it, clarity, I think. And it's a very reflective episode, sort of. Only 4 parts in, it's like we were already reflecting, but it's important that we do. And it's also important, of course, that Franz does, because Franz and the viewer are calibrated to go down the same path at the same speed, at the same rate, at the same time, and to experience all the things that happen in between. Let's just say, right? And so I guess other than that, I mean, there's really only like one other main character besides there is the landlady that he has the conversation with at the beginning, but to be honest, she's not that important, and I don't really feel like I need to ask a specific question about her. So instead, who I'll ask about next, Simone, is what did you think of the preacher? Right, there's a preacher character who ignores Franz as he begged him. He begs him for advice on how to cure the stomach pains that he receives as part of his alcohol abuse. What was the purpose of that scene in the overall episode? Because that guy's a bit of a weird one, right? It's a bit of a confusing interaction. So I'm curious to hear what your opinion is on it before I give mine.
It seems like that I take this whole episode basically on how I perceive society, or not exactly it takes place here, but the underlying context or background of how things work, not here or in other forms of media. So, and also I don't want to touch with other serious stuff, but it's also we can constitute this or how social, how ironic things are, or some are advocating for these things and these things for somehow rights or whatever, but they can do that much or exactly. Nah, it's kind of more serious. It's just or just we take or are ask ourselves that we know things, what we know what we need to do, or how that just be good to anybody or to everyone, and do what is exactly right to help other people, but it seems like that we don't usually consider it even though we know about it. That's how I see it, that this man is knowledgeable, or he can share his knowledge, he can preach or give him wisdom and direction where he is somehow lost, but he didn't. It's just we also consider some of our own judgment or prejudices in terms of these things.
Yeah, in a way, he is sort of like the personification of society at large is sort of indifference when it comes to, I guess, just empathy and basic human kindness and decency and all that. All those ideals or whatever, right? Like just the way people treat each other in a society. He is that. He is that. He is the physical manifestation of that. He's just it has to do with that bystander effect, right? It's like there are so many people around. There are so many resources in your head or whatever. Like you think literally, it's that thing where it's like you don't want to be the person who helps someone because you expect somebody else to do the work for you, and so bystander effect. It's like they've done those social experiments or whatever where it's like and they've made it, they've done it on TV and stuff too, like the cheap ones or whatever, where it's like you've got like you've got like actors. It's like two actors. They're playing like a couple, and the male actor pretends to be abusive towards the female one or whatever, and it's like they have the scene. They have a scene where they act out like a fight, and it's like it's just to see. They're filming it, and they're trying to see if anyone will step up and help the woman or whatever the situation may be. Right? They're just a lot of the time they don't. A lot of more often than it should be. It's like half the time people don't do anything. 50%'s a lot. It's like one of every two times. It could be very much the case that like everyone just watches this thing happens and doesn't do anything because they expect everybody else to do it because I don't know, they can't be bothered to, or because their brain just sort of stops when they see something like that. There's this expectation that society at large will take care of the aberrations, I guess, the exceptions in it, right? The weirdos, like and all of them, like it'll figure itself out, and that work will get done, and that's how. I mean, again, it's that sort of mindset, that indifference, that apathy. I mean, that's how the Nazis got into power. That's how shit happens. That's how things fall apart, right? Is that indifference? It's that stepping back and just letting things work themselves out. Well, they don't work themselves out because that void tends to be taken up by something so much worse, and that's how evil is. I don't know if that's how evil is born, but it's certainly how evil is supported and how it's allowed to continue living. It's how it's fed, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, the answer I have on my in my notes here is a little less interesting than that. I just put that I just put that to be honest. I'm a little confused about who the guy even is because he doesn't, his appearance doesn't really match that of the traditional preacher or whatever. He's out there when France is trying to talk to them. He talked to him. He's out there working, loading heavy cargo onto the backs of a car. Like any other working class, fellow person, and in the end, he ends up being the one who gets the keys to the bar that Franz was drinking from, that had belonged to the landlord and the landlady at the start of the episode. But of course, they get arrested for their involvement in the burglary across the street. And it's interesting to note that when even when he goes in to try to talk to the guy, just to return the bottles of beer that he had rented from the place or whatever, the guy's not even there. So he like ignores him the entire episode. It's an interesting interaction, and it could have to do with that metaphorical thing like we were talking about. Like maybe he is just that personification of societal indifference or whatever, apathy. Yeah, of course. Narratively speaking, the preacher character. I mean, he's there. I mean, when it comes down to it, within the context of the episode itself, he's little more than a prop for France to play off of to demonstrate to the audience just how sick and unwell he was for most of this episode. Nothing more, nothing less, really. Except maybe he could be a representation of just society's apathy, indifference, the thing that feeds evil, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, I don't know. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. Also, you mentioned that character from the store or where he gets his booze, and he's not. I don't know if this is. There are also other characters that seems like behave like him, that he France doesn't really exist or doesn't give that much opinion or um talk to him that much. It seems like that they choose to, especially when he's in the in the first half or in the beginning where he seems to be really lost, or he really doesn't know how things are, how things are really, some of his thoughts are really mess or not in proper order into his mind. He's trying to sort it out, and asking the other, his last resort is he's coming into his last resort and asking other people, what is this, or how can you define these things, or what things are really are. He's out on the streets, and we tend, and other people seems to just ignore him. And this is how I think it's realistic, because we tend to ignore things that we didn't really understand that much.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, who isn't, guilty of that? Like, let's not kid ourselves. It's like, how many homeless people do you ignore when you're walking in public or whatever? It's like, how many people, like, I don't know, if someone drops all their papers in the hallway at school, it's like, how many people just walk by them and don't, I got to go to class. I don't have time for this, whatever. Countless examples like that. How many people don't hold doors open for other people or whatever? It's just so many things like that, little things, but they represent that core just distance between people. Distance between individuals, and just a general lack of or absence of just basic decency and, I guess, kindness and all the things that that are kind of weird to talk about because they are so far removed from reality. Even in like a nice, I guess, nice, like, developed Western place or whatever, it's like even in the nicest parts of the world, like, you still have this apathy and this distance. It's a special thing. It's a human thing, and it's a part of, like we were talking about earlier, the human condition, right? It's something we all are affected by and are all sort of at the mercy of, right? So it's interesting, and it gives one perspective, let's just say. But yeah, I mean, so I guess to move now into the core, the crux of this episode, right? A lot of the major stuff happens between Franz and his neighbor Bauman, right? Bauman, that whole relationship is sort of the core of this episode, right? And so, Simone, what I want to ask you next is, what did you think of the card game scene? The card game scene between Franz and Bauman, in which theological comparisons are made between the story of Job in the Bible and Franz's situation in the apartment complex, where Franz is Job and Bauman is apparently the devil. What are your thoughts regarding all of that?
I'm not exactly sure if it was portrayed in this particular scene where he is talking about the how France is neglecting all the other forces that are helping him. For example, the devils and the angels, as Bauman said, are all helping her, whether it is good or bad. But France didn't like it or tend to ignore these things, and it seems like that he wanted to create his own system, but how can he be able to create his own thing or create a system for him, a mechanism for him, if he's not, if it's only he doesn't has any foundation at all? How can things that would work?
Right, yeah, because that's sort of the whole problem, right? Is that he's kind of lost his will, maybe not to live, maybe he's not like outright suicidal, but he's lost his will to fight. He's a quitter. He's given in. He's a defeatist in this episode for most of it, right? And for me, the way I took it, to go back to metaphors, because I think this episode is probably also it's the most philosophical and it's also the most, like, metaphorical of any of them so far, right? And for me, I saw this whole dynamic, especially the card game scene where both of them are slamming down the cards like really hard. There's this conflict, there's a fight going on. It's aggressive, right? And so the way I took it was that it's a clever metaphor for the battle between reason and emotion that's playing out in Franz's mind during his worst moments in this episode, right? Bauman, he represents cold logic, whereas Franz represents raw, unadulterated human despair, right? Emotion versus logic, let's say. Emotion versus reason, rationality, whatever you want to call it. The two are those two forces. It's like an angel and a devil on either shoulder, right? They're both vying for control of the man that is Franz Bieberkopf. And in the end, it seems as though logic does, in fact, win the day, but only for the time being. I mean, there are 10 more episodes. If you need any, if you don't need, if you need any other indication than that. But no, it's like uh, nothing is fully resolved, in my opinion, because it doesn't seem as though Franz really fully comprehends what it was that saved him. Even though he's able to pull himself from the depths this time, just like he did last time, he's better than he was last time, right? Because last time it's like he had other people help him. This time it was only one person, and he kind of he pulled it out. He kind of did a lot of the work on his own because the problem came more directly from himself. He was the source. But it's still he's still quite not there. He's not quite there yet. He's still got some stuff to figure out. There's still work to be done, and I think the biggest indicator of that would be how it's even when everything's over, it's like Franz doesn't seem self-aware. Like he doesn't really seem to understand the situation, and he doesn't seem to really make the connection between his recovery and Bauman's involvement in it. He still treats Bauman and I think it's just he was too sick. He was too close to it. It's kind of like when you're a teenager and you're going through puberty and you hate everything and whatever, and it's like hormones and shit. You do a bunch of ridiculous stuff, and then like a few years later, you look back on it and you cringe and you're a little embarrassed and you're like, what the hell was I thinking? It's like, well, you were thinking whatever you were thinking at the time because you were so deep in it. You were in the middle of it. It was the present. It was your reality then. It's the past now, but it was life back then. And so this is something similar, right? He's too close to it. He can't be objective. He can't look at it the way a viewer can because he's not watching himself. We're watching him. It's easy for us to make these judgments because we're not caught up in the emotions of it all and whatnot, and we don't have the same perspective that he does. We've got a privileged perspective because we're the big eye in the sky watching everything, looking down on it all and watching it all, put itself together and all that. But, yeah. So I don't know, anything you'd like to add, Simone?
And that's why also he's in this thing. Things are hard for him, even though there are a lot of people that in the past episode that tells him that, oh, this is the thing that you did, or not exactly say it directly, but made him feel that this is not the good thing to do. He's not able to think about it or consider these things because he's really into his own thoughts. He's really struggling in his own mind and trying to figure things out on his own. But how can you figure things out if you're only considering one perspective? There are a lot of pair of eyes or perspective that see or understand the things that you are doing differently, and he might be probably looking at those things, but it's really hard for him to. How can he be able? It's really not polished the way he see these things, or he doesn't come up with exact approach or realization how to see or figure things out.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And so, and that's and that builds off of what I'm about to ask you next, Simone, which is I don't know, why does Franz refuse to help himself when he's in the midst of his existential crisis, right? Because Bauman tells him during that card game scene that neither God nor Satan will be willing to pull him out of his situation. No one's going to help him because Franz himself refuses to do it on his own. He's given up, right? And so what I want to know is why do people in general refuse to help themselves when they are the only ones who can, right? You know what I mean? Like why do you think human beings operate that way?
First, because it's hard, and people are because reality or the truth uh, attacks in a different way. It hurts or it seems like that it slaps your whole its whole being. It's made you realize everything that we didn't sometimes or most of the time we doesn't want to see our mistakes or how we do things wrong because it seems like that we really believe in this crap or this path that we are taking, that it's the only option that we have, that as we think or see it, that's why we doesn't really consider other things at all. Or it is how people be or become narcissists or selfish or really into this mind, into or own all on their own minds. It's just this is all they're being, or uh, this is how, or in Filipino, it seems like it's nakasanayan, or it becomes the norm that it's everyone is doing it. So why am I not gonna follow these things? Or it seems like that it's okay to other people, so that I will also do it. It's just there are some reasons that we see other people, although it's a group mentality. It gives us somehow motivation, even though it's really wrong.
Yeah, it's that whole bandwagon phenomenon. You know, it's like everyone else is doing it. I don't want to fall behind. I don't want to be left in the dust. So I'm going to get on while I still can and all that. You know, while everything's still fresh and hot and whatever. Even if it isn't, even if it goes against my morals, even if it goes against who I really am as a person, so on and so forth. I'm going to do this because everybody else is. The whole herd. You know, follow the herd, follow the pack. Be a good little sheep and all that. You know, yada yada yada. Right. Yeah, there is an aspect of that in here for sure. But you know what I saw, I think you're right. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I didn't think of that. So good. But what I thought of, for me, it's like you said, it's hard, right? And I think the reason why it's hard is because people struggle to admit when they've done something wrong, right? Or when they're wrong about something. And a lot of the time, rather than simply admit that they made a mistake, or that they made a miscalculation, or that their opinion was just straight up wrong, that they believed something that wasn't true, that they made a prediction or whatever, or an assumption, or had a preconceived notion that was proven false by something or other, right? Rather than just admit that and move on, they instead, a lot of the time, they double down on whatever that thing is, whatever their mistake was, for the sake of, I don't know, preserving their pride or their ego, or, dignity, or whatever it is that they think they're doing. But what it ends up doing is creating more problems for them in the future, right? Everything unravels from that point forward until there's nothing left when you go on living like that. And it's something that's gotten worse over the years, I think. And maybe if it hasn't gotten worse, maybe it's always been that way. I'm sure it has always been that way to a certain extent. But if it hasn't gotten worse over the years, at least in the present moment, we are more aware of it than we ever have been before, right? There's more of a spotlight drawn onto this phenomenon, this aspect of human nature, than there has been really, at least in my lifetime, right? And whatever. It's like you didn't hear about as much of this in the early to mid 2010s. It was really, it was like 2015 when this kind of behavior started getting widespread from people on, like, the internet, let's just say, for example, and in politics, certain rhetorical styles and whatnot, certain political tactics and stuff like that. That sort of thing happened in 20. It started in 2015, and it's been going on for the past 6 years ever since, right? And it's gotten worse. It's kind of ramped up the more time has gone by, right? But I mean, I guess if you think, in the early 2000s, like in the 2000s, there was the whole, in American politics, there was the anti-George Bush stuff, and I guess Tony Blair in the UK and all that. So I mean, it's always been a thing. It's always. I'm not saying it's never. This is like the first time. This is the first time in human history this has ever happened. It's like, no. Look at any prosperous society or whatever. It's like Rome. Rome. Well, Berlin. Weimar, which is where this is set in the Weimar era, the end of the Weimar Republic, right? Basically, the tail end of all of that, or the aftermath, whatever. And America's just going through the same things that those other societies went through and all that. French Revolution and all that, right? Look to history for countless examples of this sort of thing occurring. It's all a cycle, You start here and then you go all the way around and you end up right back there. We started here, we're right here right now, and eventually we'll get back there, and it'll just keep the wheel, the wheel in the sky keeps on turning, as they say, right? As the song goes. Yeah, I always say it. I always say it on here, but it's like if you need an example of this kind of behavior, this double downing, this refusal to take accountability or responsibility for words and actions and whatnot, just go on Twitter, go on Reddit, look at media platforms, not just social media, but media like the news websites, news channels, I guess YouTube channels, whatever. And look at celebrities, look at the elite or whatever. People hate accountability. They are terrified at the thought of being wrong, right? And even more adverse to admitting when they're wrong, right? And I think the only way to improve in life, to improve as a person, to evolve, to grow up, to be an actual adult, like we all should be eventually, is it's to accept the responsibility for your fuck ups, right? For your mistakes. Because the sooner you do, the sooner you're free. You know what I mean? But in the Western world, anyway, that seems to be difficult. So a difficult thing for a lot of people to do, and maybe it's because they've had things so good for all or almost all of their entire lives. But if I kind of feel as though if everyone in the world today had to go through something rough, like let's say boot camp or like a fast food or retail job, some shitty experience, long-term experience, they'd get a bit more perspective, right? And I think what goes hand in hand with all of this is just a general lack of gratitude and lack of exposure to how things are in the real world that makes the West as fucked as it is and always has been, fucked as it is lately and how it I guess always has been. But I mean, I guess obviously, the world's a mess in general, so I don't know. That's just what I've seen in my limited experience anyway. But it's like this is why all these politicians and all these celebrities, all these public figures and stuff. This is why they can be outraged. They have the luxury to be moral, to get on their soapbox and preach whatever bullshit they feel like preaching. It's because they grew up with a lot, and they're guilty of it. There's a guilt aspect too. They were born in a silver spoon. They were born with the proverbial silver spoon. They had one in the mouth, one up the ass. Most of these people, right? It's the way it is for whatever reason, and so they can preach all they want because I guess they need to or whatever. They feel like they have to because they feel like they've done something wrong by being who they are instead of just taking that and accepting that and doing something that's actually good. It's like, well, why not divert that energy to, let's say, fighting for gay rights in the Middle East, because that's a part of the world where gay people are still thrown off of balconies and stuff for simply liking who they like. Why don't you focus on a real cause like that instead of bitching on the internet? Going on, I gotta get my tweet out. I gotta get my tweet. I hate everybody. You don't agree with my opinion, so I'm gonna get you canceled. I did a good thing today. I'm a hero. Fuck the keyboard warrior. Fuck all that. Fucking fake, disingenuous, moral grandstanding bullshit, man. It's got to stop. It's got to stop. It's got to get to a point where the bubble just bursts and it stops being a thing. It just has to. But it's because of the support that the culture gives it. They like to say the climate. The way the climate is right now. But seriously though, it's like the way the climate is right now. Too many people do it. It's a thing, and it shouldn't be. It should never be a thing. So yeah, I don't know, man. Is there anything you'd like to add to any of that, Simone?
And also it seems like that even though it's against their reputation, those things that they done wrong, it seems like that other people see it as a thing that builds their confidence, even though it's ironically or obviously wrong. It's just some made this kind of build their uh, names or reputation as something that breaks their reputation. They take it as something to make it stronger. Especially in the internet, take these people on celebrities, as you mentioned, that it seems like all these issues and all these random nonchalant dramas on the internet is what make their career or sustain everything that they are in or they are known for.
Yeah.
They make it a living, even it's really wrong. And other people find maybe the reason why it's become a thing as you mentioned during 2015 is because other people copy this kind of approach or this character because they thought for some it works, and now it doesn't. It seems that it works for everyone. It just makes the system really bad.
It does. it ruins it for everybody. For all the people, the majority of people out there who don't get involved in this sort of thing. It's like now everything has been depreciated a little bit. Everything has been devalued slightly now, and so it's bad. It's bad. It's not good. It would be fine if the people who did it lived in a bubble, lived in a separate part of whatever, if they were just not in the culture, but they are, and it affects everybody, and it sucks. It's stupid. You've gotten like the majority of the global population involved in some stupid little battle or whatever that they want absolutely nothing to do with, But I guess it's just human nature. This is how these things work. It's just another one of those like anthropological trends or currents or whatever, it's bound to happen, and it's stupid. It's stupid that it's still happening. We should be to a point where we're civilized and tolerant enough to where things like this don't crop up as much, or at least to whatever extent. But it's like, well, I don't know. We don't know how to deal with the internet yet. Yada yada yada. This is a huge detour, but that's basically what it comes down to, right? I think the day we get used to the internet being a part of our lives is the day that we move past this shit and just go back to the way things should be, or the way things used to be. I don't think we'll go back to the way things used to be. I think it'll be better, because we'll have learned the lessons along the way, or whatever. We'll come out of this with a collective experience. All people in general, right? We'll know what not to do, It's helped us grow, I guess, but growth, it's growing pain. Growth is bound to come with some growing pains, let's just say. So yeah, that's what's been happening lately. Enough. I don't think that's really a political thing. It's more of a social commentary thing. But yeah. Back to the philosophical side of things now. The part that I like a lot, a lot more. Simone, we've talked about this. We've talked about it kind of all throughout this discussion so far. But let's get really into it now, right? How do you think Franz's sickness in this episode, his crisis, or whatever you want to call it, how does his existential crisis in this episode compared to the crisis he had in the first one?
Somehow he is sane when it comes to this specific scenario. In the in the first episode, he's really in the agony. It's just agony, not only externally, but his whole being is really not in a good shape. But now he's able to know what particular system is. Where does all this internal forces or these contrasting forces or forces that they're trying to break each other, or contrasting or polar opposites forces that are taking inside his being or his systems. He's able that it is only internally, yes, how it is. That in the first episode is just how he look at things, how he look at everything, even though it's just a single atom or a matter. Is just he thinks that all of it are his enemy or something that will harm him in all aspects. And also in this one, what I noticed in this one, it seems like that it only took. It seems like that the whole episode takes only in a few. It takes in a few days or few weeks or in a few weeks. It's just small little times, but it could be also an element of it that how this kind of things or how we think of this or trying to figure out these battles that especially the that he's in, his tunnel battles that he's in, that it seems like that it's only the other people see it, or the outside, the different players that are looking into Franz. It seems like that it only takes for a while. It only happens, or Franz himself that thinks that it only happens for a while, but the reality it takes so long for it to be able to figure it out.
Yeah. And, as I've said a bunch of times in this episode, or in this discussion, well, I guess this podcast episode so far, the root cause of Franz's illness in this episode is much more directly associated with the demented side of his personality, right? Whereas in the first episode, he was mostly just sick because of his time in prison. The psychological effects of solitary confinement and all that, right? the problem was less personal and more like I would say clinical, right? But here, this time in episode 4, it's all about Franz, right? Because the problem comes directly from Franz, from within Franz, right? And Franz, the rest of Franz, I guess, is forced to confront it more head on than he had to last time. The problem sort of resolved itself, but not really. It's like how it's like how a person, you're cleaning your room and you stuff all your shit under your bed or in your closet or whatever. It's like the shit's still there. You didn't really organize. You didn't go through it and fold clothes and put them all up nice and neatly. Like the problem's still there. You've just put it out of sight, out of mind or whatever. It's still there. And you're eventually, maybe whether it's months or years later, you're still going to have to take care of it eventually. It's not done. There's no proper resolution to that. That's kind of what's going on here with Franz, right? Between the first episode and this fourth one now, 3 episodes later, the problem has now come, it's come to bite him back. I guess it's come back to bite him in the ass, let's just say. Even though he still hasn't fully come to terms with the darkness in him yet, right? He's one step closer to being redeemed or whatever, or free than he was before. Because this time around, he sort of had to be, right? Because the first time he was sick, it was almost as though, like I said, the world at large and other people around him were the ones who got him out of it, which, hell, was probably part of the reason why he had a second crisis not long after, like I said before, because he hadn't really resolved anything during that first go-around. And I'm sure there'll be more to come from here. And maybe there's a possibility that he might never fully get over it at all. By the very end, he might still be just as messed up as he was all throughout, so you never know. We'll see how things go, but 10 more episodes, got to see how they develop from this moment forward, right? This moment on. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, let's move to the next one.
Sure. So, and this is, we've talked about the aspect of this show that's more experimental, right? That features things that come from outside of things, right? So in episode 1, you had the long descriptions of like medical and scientific like processes and terminologies and everything that were juxtaposed. So like, the narrator would be reading something about like Newton's law while Franz was on screen beating his wife to death with a brush comb, very disturbing juxtaposition, this contrast between something very unemotional and logical and something very, shocking and visceral, right? Something that gets a reaction out of a person, right? You have that lack of passion from the narrator, but then, of course, the passion from the viewer. It's a weird dynamic, right? It's a weird sort of clash, right? It clashes. The two sort of, they butt heads. In this episode, you have a lot of that, too. I mean, so yeah, and then episode 2, you had the poems and everything from the prisoner and the bar scene where they were singing songs and all that. And you had stuff in episode 3 as well. Can't really remember what it is off the top of my head, but in episode 4, you have the inclusion of these like extended, these weird slideshows and explanations and demonstrations of this time it's cattle slaughter in this episode, killing cows and pigs and sheep and all that for for farming, for agriculture, right? For the meat, for the wool, so on and so forth. And at one point, actually, in this episode, a goat is killed live on camera, right? Like a person, does, and it's not like a it might be a brutal death, but it's not a weird one. It's like it's a standard, it's like a farmer doing a farmer's job, right? Of just going through the specific process that there is to slaughter a an animal, farm animal like that, right? Just slitting the throat, and they do it, and you see the lamb, it like convulses on screen, and it's a whole scene, and the guy who does it, he's like it's a weird one. He looks like he's like some sort of god or something, like he's taken out of a page from mythology or like some sort of Renaissance painting or something. It's a very abstract little sequence, right? And so what I'm wondering, Simone, is what do these things add to the viewer's experience, and what did you take away from them personally?
That's what makes this episode works. There are a lot of things that take place. There are different approaches that are seems to be concrete or goes well along with each other. The juxtaposition that she mentioned uh, uh, earlier is also is exactly present in this one. From the logic that Bowman introduces him or he talks about to him, and also other things that we might consider that he should might or he should consider, or things that are obviously right in front of his face, or that he tend to neglect because he's really into his things. Uh, just like in any other forms of might be playing on some things, some belief system or whatever. There are maybe some of it are constituted with a particular similar idea, but they take things differently. They has a different perspective on this particular use and what else. But to generalize it, it seems like that it's also route, or the road will also ends on a one destination.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All paths lead to whatever. Right. And yeah. I mean, for me, these sequences, they've been highly experimental, I guess, but they've never crossed the line into pretentious territory. They don't become too much. They don't. It's like you got to be careful with it. I guess just to make another analogy, it's like putting salt in your soup, right? It's like if you just sprinkle a little bit, it makes the soup better than it was before when it was unsalted, right? It adds flavor. It brings out the other flavors that were already in there to begin with. It makes it overall a much better meal, right? But if you accidentally knock the top off and the entire thing of salt goes into the soup, it's ruined. And all that there is, it's just soup. It's just salt now. It's just salt soup, and it dominates it and it ruins it. And that's you got to be careful with this experimental avant-garde, let's just say, art house stuff that in these sorts of movies and stuff, because it can get to the point where it just completely distracts from everything else. It takes away from everything else, and it becomes the one thing. It becomes the centerpiece when it's not meant to be. When it's meant to be an accentuator, a flavor packet, let's just say. You don't want your coffee to be too sweet. You don't want your soup to be too salty, I guess, right? But it doesn't get to that point, right? Instead, what it does is it has a message to say, a point to be made about the banality of existence in general, but especially of human existence, right? The uselessness, I guess. And maybe something about how we need to strive to be more than animals, because if we don't, we're no better to them. We're no better than them, and might as well be slaughtered as well in a way, right? Like we might as well, they're. And you see that in sci-fi and speculative fiction and stuff, where it's like, well, let's say, what if there's a story where there's a race of aliens who are much smarter than we are, much more advanced, and they look at us, the human race, as we as human beings look at ants, right? So we don't mean anything to them, and they could slaughter us the way that we kill. They could kill us and eat us the way we kill and eat cows, and don't really think about it. At least not most of us, right? It just doesn't matter to the vast majority of people. And so yeah, it's a similar dynamic there, right? And this is a question we've seen this before in a lot of the things that we've covered on the channel, right? This comparison between human beings and animals, and this sort of like, well, if human beings are just animals, what really makes us that different from pigs and sheep and birds and all that? And it's like, well, I think what we decided on in previous episodes of the podcast or whatever was that what makes human beings unique is our sentience, right? Our ability to reflect and to think and to ask deep, philosophical, ask the big questions, right? To look at the world and the universe around us and go, I wonder what this thing is. I wonder what that is. And to through science and through philosophy and through writing and art and everything to meditate upon these issues and to come up with answers or solutions or whatever, to develop perspectives, right? Pigs can't really do that, I mean, and it's interesting because gorillas are, they're pretty goddamn smart. A lot of primates are smart. They're the animals who are most closely related to us, right? Dolphins as well. I mean, I guess we could go on and on about that, but that's not really what we're talking about. Obviously, that's taking it a little too literally. The crux of this thing, the point is that when it comes down to it, fundamentally, there are people who could make the argument that there is very little that I guess, separates us from pigs here, from the rest of the animal kingdom, whatever, here, and us here, right? And it's something that we should always be aware of, right? But also on the other side of the coin, with by including these like segments, this aspect of like cattle slaughter, this weird theme in the episode, right? There's also something being said about the cruelty of mankind, right? Us as humans, that whole thing about accountability or whatever you want to call it, right? And how again we're at odds with our nature in these increasingly like I guess civilized or like unnatural times, quote unquote, that we're living in, because just the way things are, it's like living creatures have to kill other living creatures in order to sustain themselves, unless we have some technology, I mean, I guess you got that like Beyond Meat or whatever, that artificial meat that tastes like regular meat and has the same sort of nutritional benefits. I'm not really sure about the science of it all. I'm not sure if you could eat that for the rest of your life and sustain yourself the same way that you could if you would eat regular meat like people have, since the dawn of mankind and all that, right? But yeah, it's like just the way things are, the circle of life from the Lion King, right? It's like we all have to. That's that and all that. That's how the world works. It's like it's sort of, I mean, like even vegetarians, for example, they're killing living organisms. Even vegans have to kill living organisms in order to sustain themselves because plants are just as alive as anything else. Even if we can't tell, it's like they're they're alive. They just are. And so all of this to say that it all interconnects, right? It all the universe is constantly feeding off of itself, and that's part of the reason why it has to eventually end, right? Because everything is ultimately finite. It will all eventually run out. All these resources, all this energy, just from a physical perspective, physics, the science, energy, what makes things move, what makes things happen, work and all that. It will all eventually go away, one way or another. Unless, of course, we miraculously manage to innovate enough technologically to the point where we can somehow cheat death as a species and, time travel or move to another planet or, skip universe skip or whatever, go to different dimensions and all that shit, the multiverse, whatever. All this really distant stuff that neither of us or no one in our generation or, probably in our century are ever going to see happen, right? Like, it's just not going to be a thing that we live to see materialize one way or the other. Well, we can speculate about it while we're still alive, right? Why not? Might as well. But yeah, that's a possibility maybe, but it's hard to imagine in 2021, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But and so yeah, the way things stand now, it's like the sun's going to get bigger and bigger until it burns us all to crisp, right? Scorches the earth, gets rid of all life there, and Earth is just like Mars or worse, it's like Venus or something. It's just all rock and, empty, blank surface. And then one day, the sun will have a supernova blow up and and then the rest of the universe along with it, right? Everything will expand until it booms or whatever, We don't really know, but that's the speculation, right? And all of this to say, the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that this will all happen eventually, but the clock is always ticking. There's never a moment where the world is not spinning. There's never a moment where these processes aren't happening. There's never a moment where things aren't decaying. All life is just one big slow process of decay, right? And you know what? Even though it's a common literary comparison to make or artistic comparison to make between humans on the one hand and animals on the other, to me it's the kind of lesson that none of us can ever really fully truly learn. Do you know what I mean? Like it's something that's so far beyond our basic like human comprehension of things that 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 will always need to be reminded of it, right? We need constant reminders of what our existence really is, what the nature of all of this that's going on is, because otherwise we forget, otherwise we get caught up in all the minute everyday stuff of our lives, right? And either that or we get sick of thinking about it because it scares us or it makes us uncomfortable or it depresses us. It makes it feel like a hopeless situation or whatever. And so, we do that, we dismiss it, and you do what a lot of people on the internet seem to do, which is try to like laugh right into life's face, but that doesn't work, because in the end, only one truth stands, right? And that's the I guess that's the real truth, or the universal truth, or whatever you want to call it. It's not your personal truth. It's not your personal interpretation of the truth. It's the objective, empirical, scientific, whatever you want to call it, truth. And even science is not, there are arguments to be made about whatever. I don't know. There is that universal truth that exists beyond us, I guess. Because everything we know, everything we think, just like science and art and all that, it all comes from us. There's none of that comes from, any other source than us, really. We're looking into things and interpreting them in our own human way, right? And so that's what I'm trying to say. It's a matter of perspective, and maybe we're flawed in our thinking, and we are. A lot of us are just, even at our best, we're flawed in our comprehension of things. We're just wrong, we just don't get it, a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. I would say the majority of the time. So yeah, it's, at the end of the day, it's a matter of whether we stand up to match the level that the truth is at, right? To get to its height, let's just say, to stand tall as it stands, and to strive to get closer to it more and more every day, every year, every century, every millennium, whatever, right? Either that, or either that, or we sink to the ground like everybody else, like the people on Twitter, like pigs rooting in the mud. It's a bit harsh, but it's true. Like Bauman, like most German existentialism and philosophy in general, right? I mean, hell, just look at Arthur Schopenhauer, as a perfect example of that, right? He's one of the most depressing philosophers you could find, but at the same time, there's a lot to learn from pessimism. You just can't let it control you. You can't make it the only thing in your life or whatever. The only perspective that you take. As with anything else, you need, as with anything else with philosophy and with just thinking in general, you need to have a balanced diet, right? And so, I guess all of this to say, like, yeah, sure, everything's going to end, but it doesn't mean that you have to be miserable. It doesn't mean that you have to be depressing, because you don't want to get to a point where you're on your deathbed and you're, because we all die, right? It's not fun. It isn't. It's not. There's no way around it. It's like you're going to get to a point where your body gives up and all the life fades out of you. It's like you don't want to be on your deathbed and bitching, and you don't want to be in a terrible mood. Like it's gonna happen. It happens to all of us. It's the thing that brings us together almost. We should look at death as a unifying force as opposed to a dividing one. And so it's like, well, when you're like, if you're lucky, when you're like 106, or when you're 95, or when you're 73 and you're on your deathbed, 83, 84, whatever, do you want to be pissed? Do you want to be bitter? Do you want to be sad? Or do you want to be surrounded by family, friends? Do you want to go out on a high note? Do you want to go out with dignity and take it in stride and just go, I'm ready, death, you're waiting at the doorstep. I'm ready to face you. I'm ready to get up and shake your hand like a real man, or whatever. What approach do you want to take? And so basically apply that to the way you think. Apply that to your worldview. Apply that to all of the things you do while you're alive. Do, think, and feel while you still got time to actually, make things happen. That's kind of how I see all of that. Is there anything you'd like to add, Simone?
Yeah, it's also that why these things, or maybe it's quite far, but it's the argument whether it's good for us to kill animals or not, or if we are more advanced, or what set us different, or much make us more advanced, or not animal at all in some sense. It's just why it's been an argument for 1,000 years, or maybe it's since the beginning of humankind. I guess it might be even though it's become a thing of survival, probably that people might be way back then also think about these things in these existential issues.
Yeah.
Because it's a never-ending argument, because it seems like that we haven't find the truth, or it is something that we need to be reminded of, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to be in the moment, to think what it really is, or aside from the things that we are focused on, for example, um, money or greed or whatever that makes us more improve as an individual, or all the, what do you call this, all the attention or whatever it is, that we need to something that will bring us into the moment, or to make us things for ourselves, to consider it, these things. If we are really lost on our ways, there might be some wake up calls or some lights to guide us to
Right.
get back to where we all from.
Yeah, and that sort of connects to the last few questions I have for this particular discussion, right? Like and the show in general, right? Because immediately, right after that happens, I mean the episode, like I said before, it ends with the landlady and the landlord in the apartment complex that Franz is staying at. It ends with them getting arrested for burglary, right? And so for me, that scene, it represents that, like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like how people tend to be very myopic and very like narrow in their view of things, right? Like they're only thinking in the short term. They're only thinking about tomorrow or next week. They're not thinking about 10 years from now. They're not thinking about the rest of their lives usually, right? The long term, right? And so that was how I saw that from a personal or like philosophical perspective or whatever. It's like the landlord and the landlady, they were willing to involve themselves in the burglary because they wanted the money. They wanted to see the money in their hand. They wanted it today, basically. They wanted it that day, that night, whatever. They weren't thinking about the rest of their lives. Now their reputations are ruined. They probably lost their business license and all that. They're probably going to go to jail. And it's with Franz as well. Franz killing his wife. I mean, that was a different thing. It was emotional, right, or whatever. It was emotional. It was psychological, crazy, whatever. I don't know. But it's the same thing, right? It's like because his life has kind of been completely derailed by that as well. Even though the society is much more tolerant there than it would be, I guess, today in most places, most parts of the world. It's like he's still fucked up, and it's like he still has to make up for all of that. He's in a he's the entire series so far. He's been in the red. He's been running a deficit. He's got a debt to pay. He's got to make up for something. And now the landlord and the landlady have to as well because they fucked up. Because they weren't thinking. They weren't thinking about the future, right? They weren't thinking about, whatever, think mark, that whole, thing or whatever, right? Like, so, and it's also, I guess, from a social and political perspective as well, it's another sign that Germany is about to slip into total and social and political entropy. So that the thing that's happening on the individual level is happening on a societal level as well, a societal basis. It's that void, like we were talking about earlier. And now that the stage is set for someone like the Nazis to come in and break everything even more than it already is. So, I don't know, Simone, what did you think of I guess my question is, what did you think of the burglary and its end results?
Yeah, I think I'm good. I remember some stuff from, if I uh I it might be quite far again. As I'm reading the Diary of a Young Girl, it might be related to Nazism because it takes place during the Holocaust. But seems like that before or during the time that burglary becomes a thing, that is, people seems to resort in these kinds of issues, or because there might be not only the societal own desire for a living or something, but it also somehow becomes a thing to make a living, to be able to survive. There might be we only see a one particular perspective, or one side of the story in terms of the landlady. There might be some other um, personal reasons or personal interests that are included in it, but um, it was portrayed in a way that it becomes selfish, or what really it's normally is, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. It was dog eat dog, sort of like I matter more than you do. I'm just gonna help myself, basically. Chaos. It's just chaos. It's pure entropy. It's on the verge, anyway. It's it's not good. That's not how the world should work. That's not how any society should function. It's not the sign of a healthy environment, let's just say. But yeah, and then also, so after that, of course, one of the last highlights from this episode would be Friends' conversation with the old newspaper vendor from episode 2, the one who was selling the controversial magazines, who, Lena basically, she forbade Friends from working for him because of the content of the publications or whatever. But now Friends is back and he talks to him. They get into a conversation, and that's where I got the the whole thing about like how you get old, you die anyway, and nothing in life is certain, except maybe for the fact that everything ends, right? That's the one guarantee. But obviously, nihilism and pessimism and resignation, giving up, they aren't the way to go. That's what this episode was all about. Friends, if he had given up, that would have been it. But 10 more episodes, so and he pulled he pulled his head out of his ass. He got out of the situation. But if he hadn't, he probably would have died. He probably would have drank himself to death. And that's another thing too. It's like they referenced the other person living in the place, right? And that he was afraid of becoming his neighbor in the apartment complex. There was a mention of a 64-year-old man who just keeps drinking all day, and how he's basically he's cheating the medical system to get money so that he can continue to drink. And he doesn't that was a flash forward. That's a vision of what Franz's life could end up like if he's not too careful. If he had stayed and wallowed in his own self-pity and everything in the moment. But yeah, and so this conversation with the old newspaper vendor, it harkens back to that theme, right? That there is more to life than the bad, and if you don't figure that out soon enough, you could very well run the risk of dying miserable, and for no good reason. It's avoidable. You don't have to go out that way. You have to go out, but you don't have to go out that way. You can control your attitude in your moment of death, I guess. I guess, man, unless you get into a car accident or something. But generally speaking, anyway, right? And yeah, obviously, I mean, I don't think anyone really wants to die. Period. Even if you're suicidal, it's like you want to die to get away from your problems. But you probably, if you had to choose between living a good, happy life and not living life at all, I'm sure most people would want to live the happy life. They would choose that option, obviously, right? But nobody wants to die at period. But we all do, whether we want to or not. And so you might as well, like I said before, you might as well go out on a high note and be positive and be upright and be a man, or a woman or whatever, be the best possible version of yourself that you can be in that moment. I guess just basically buck up, chump, and all that. So I don't know, Simone. What did you think of the of Franz's conversation with the old newspaper vendor? And is there anything you'd like to add before we move on to the final question of this episode's tonight's discussion?
The way that I see the whole scene, or him just looking or attempting or thinking really what's his next move is, or his first introduce, or after the scene or whatever, he's back into the train station, the subway, I guess, and he's looking at the thinking of approaching the the man who sells this newspapers and other books. It seems like that I had this thing that are coming out of my mind, that I'm thinking that perhaps you shouldn't do this. It's that man might probably condemn you for what Lena did, or it probably not a good idea. I think that it might not be a good idea for how things settled to the last time. But
yeah,
it's a good thing that it's not that. It's really that this particular man, he give us also a reason. It's really reached this particular episode is character rich. There are a lot of characters that are really can stand on their own, or not just a background character that we might thought, especially this man on the subway. It's just I thought that he will just sell newspaper and give these stuff to Pratt, and that's all. But along the way, we especially this one, we able to see him as one important character who gave us this important lesson that to change our perspective, to look things differently, because it might be the only way around that. This is you mentioned about this death, or how we might fear it, or what would it be that everyone might. The reality is that it should be something that will unify us.
Yeah.
That's how I see that. How also this man approached this thing, that although that one day I might die, and what I need to do is to enjoy the life that I have left now.
Yeah, he took the very adult perspective there, and he was like, water under the bridge. It's not going to be a problem. There's no unnecessary conflict. He's not bitter. He understands. He gets that Franz is young, and that he was in love or whatever. That he had a woman at the time. He gets it. He gets it. He's lived his life. He's been there and done that. I liked that too. I liked that he wasn't a kind of I guess a dick, an unnecessary dick about it. I'm glad that he had an understanding, and he was able to kind of reach across the aisle, or whatever you want to call it, and shake hands, meet him halfway, and all that. It was good. Yeah. Because I also had that in mind too. It was a bit unexpected that he was, that he had such a tolerant attitude or whatever, such an understanding perspective. But that seems to be this environment in general anyway. So it's interesting. It's weird how it works. Yeah. But okay. Last but not least, of course, there is Franz's reunion with Mech at the very end. And so I guess this is like a double. It's a two-part question or whatever. First of all, Simone, what did you think of the reunion between Franz and Mech? And secondly, are things going to work out better now than they did before in the previous episodes? Are they still friends, or will the whole business with Lena still remain an issue in future episodes? And what's going to happen, do you think, in the next episode, let's just say, in episode 5? In general. And then we'll close out.
What I written on my notes about it, I think it's one of the. I only written some 7 points that I wanted to focus on, or some things that I get into after getting out of the show. I think like I wrote here that I shouldn't doubt it, or the Max loyalty, because he's really a good friend. He's not the friend or the other way around that I saw in my friend first impression when Franz left, or how the last episode ended the other time around. Because he's really the loyal one, and also how things will work, and he doesn't hide the reality between him and Lena, that he confessed that they he lived with Lena for a while after Viverka left, and also before Lena left or go to her own ways, or to live on her own. That which is, he doesn't really know what happened to her. Just he is really the good friend that Franz had. That he's someone that no matter what will happen next, or what are the tests of times that might happen on the last 10 episode, that he'll, no matter what happened, Franz still got a friend in Matt. He's the friend that won't leave him at all. And also how these episodes end. Also, I guess I got some predictions how will the next episode will start. That it would be a much, now that Franz is back to normal, he's getting to his new system, he's able to know himself more. It's just the next one will pave into to getting into more of this, to be able to living it out, living the whole thing. But probably the main conflict that might take place are probably Eva, and also other things from the past that might came back.
Yeah. For me, I think the relationship between Franz and Mech will be fine, you know. But my main prediction is that they'll end up going into crime again together, right? Because we've already established at the end, he's now Mech is working selling clothes, but he steals the clothes. You know, it's not pure work. There's something shady about it, you know. And so my prediction or assumption for the next episode is that Franz won't have any other choice but to get back into that life. Even though he wanted to go straight, he wanted to go do the proper thing. He's now kind of fucked, you know. As for Lena, she'll probably slip out of his mind, you know, just as easily and quickly as Franz is, you know, his dead wife's sister from the first episode did, right? You know, they parted ways, and she hasn't been referenced since. You know, she hasn't come up in the show at all ever since that first episode, right? And so I think something similar will happen with Lena. You know, she's just one of the many, I guess, moth women that fly towards Franz's light. So I guess those are my general predictions for what's to come next. But for now, I don't know. What do you think, Simone? Is there anything else you'd like to bring up? Did you have any other points you wanted to make outside of the questions that I asked for our discussion, or anything like that before we close out? I feel like we did a good talk. I feel like this was a good one. You know, I think we pulled it off. You know, and I think this was a good episode to get things out of. You know, it was ripe for discussion.
Yeah, I think I agree that all the things that we can cover or we can get from this episode, that we're able to tackle those. Even the things that I didn't even notice while watching the show, that we're able to brought it up here, to be able to reflect on that particular scenes. I think this is what the watching the show is really all about, or to be able to get into these realizations and reflections.
All right, cool. So thank you guys for watching. This has been episode 27 of the Imperial Tides podcast, and part 4 of 14 of Berlin Alexanderplatz. 10 more to go. Hopefully, you guys stick with us. You know, engage in the comments section and all that. Hit that big red subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more. And yeah, stay tuned. And peace.